And so they had to come up with a new justification. And so finding a new justification for American power, this became a bit of a joke, the need for a new enemy. We have to find a new enemy. And people repeatedly said, only half jokingly, they missed the Cold War. But it was only half joking because they did miss the Cold War and they wanted to recreate the Cold War. Obviously, if you look for an enemy, eventually you will find an enemy.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I've got with me a fantastic scholar from the University of Arizona. I'm talking to Dr. David N. Gibbs, a professor of history who wrote numerous important books helping us to understand the contemporary United States of America, among them Revolt of the Rich, how the politics of the 1970s widened America's class divide. And the one we want to focus on today in particular is First, Do No Harm. Humanitarian Intervention and the Destruction of Yugoslavia. First, we will be talking about the neocons and then their eternal lust for humanitarian intervention. So, David, welcome.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time. You had this wonderful segment a couple of years ago at
Yeah.
Oxford University. You debated with one of the heads of the strategy of intervention back at the time, and we will talk about that in the second segment in particular. But one of the most important things here is that you do have a very clear picture about this line of thought in the United States that we talk about often also on this channel, which is the neocons, this neoconservative movement, and their entire, well, warmongering, I would say in simple terms. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about the neocons, where they're coming from?
Neoconservatism, as it was called, has really become the dominant ideology of the foreign policy establishment, first in the United States, and now quite clearly in Europe as well, almost to the point that it has no challengers, at least for the moment. And the essence of neoconservatism for foreign policy is a kind of extreme militarism and reliance upon military force and a de-emphasis or disparaging of negotiations and a certain sense that enough military force will solve problems, will solve almost any major international problem, and that the need for military force really is more a question of attitude, that the United States is so powerful, NATO is so powerful that only a question of will and ideological spine among policymakers that is really required to achieve objectives. And it's now being fully tested in the Middle East and even more dramatically in Ukraine. Now, the origin, well, should I stop and go into the origin of this ideology, or do you want to ask me a question?
No, no, please, please. The origins. I had a talk once with Michael Brenner on this channel, and he already talked about the origins, but I wonder where you see it coming from.
All right. Well, the origins clearly was in the 1970s, and the context was American failure in Vietnam, and it was called the Vietnam Syndrome. And specifically, America was losing the war in Vietnam and ultimately did lose the war in Vietnam. And for a major power to lose a war is extremely damaging and humiliating. And it did enormous damage to America's credibility worldwide. I mean, just none of America's allies were willing to back the United States. Not even Britain or Canada were willing to send combat forces into Vietnam. Australia did and Korea did, so there were a couple of exceptions. But generally speaking, the war was extremely unpopular in Europe. There was much greater independence, I should add, in Europe than there is today among almost all the European powers. Today it seems like the European powers do whatever the United States tells them to do. That wasn't the case earlier on during the Cold War. And in Vietnam, where there was dramatic demonstration of this. What it's worth, I remember in college hearing a speech by Harold Wilson, who'd been former Prime Minister of Britain, and he said in his speech, I remember hearing it in college about in the 1960s, he was begged by President Johnson to send just a symbolic British contingent would parade around Saigon and just show symbolic British support for the war, and he just flatly refused. And it reflected the fact that the war was being lost, and nobody wants to get involved in losing a war. So there was that. Now, domestically, the damage was even greater because the foreign policy establishment, the military, the CIA, the presidency, all the associated think tanks, we call the foreign policy establishment in America, they'd all been massively discredited by the Vietnam War. By the incompetence of the war and all the reports of brutality. There was the report of the My Lai massacre, where U.S. forces massacred 500 women and children, mostly, without any opposition whatsoever. And there was the Pentagon Papers, the release of the history of the Pentagon, secretly written by the Pentagon itself, which demonstrated, it was leaked by a Pentagon insider who was, his conscience was bothering him, Daniel Ellsberg. I remember growing up very much admiring him. He leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. And, to paraphrase what Ellsberg himself said, it showed that 4 American presidents, one after the other, from Truman all the way to Johnson, had lied and lied and lied. That's the words he used, lied and lied and lied. And all of this, did a lot of damage to America's ability to project power overseas. There was a decrease in military spending to the lowest level of the Cold War. The Senate held hearings in the Central Intelligence Agency under Senator Frank Church, which were real investigative hearings that got enormous attention. And, they revealed all sorts of very disturbing things about the CIA: overthrow of government, secret wars, assassinations, lying to the public, illegal spying on American citizens. And, all of this meant that the major institutions of foreign policy and domestic security, the FBI was discredited. All of this weakened America's ability to act as a superpower and to project power overseas in the Southern Hemisphere. Third world countries, as we used to call them, were openly acting disrespectfully and combatively towards the United States, and also towards American corporations, I should add. And so this was the context. And neoconservatism was a reaction against this. There was a whole series of vested interests. Well, neoconservatives were, by the term neo, meant these were former liberals. Some of them even had leftist associations in their youth. A number of them came from Trotskyist backgrounds during the 1930s. And they were very disturbed by the lack of respect for foreign policy institutions. So these were mostly older academics and writers, some of the top writers in the country, in fact, often associated with liberal causes in the past. And they moved right. They moved right on domestic policy too, but it was mainly on foreign policy that they made their contribution. There was a senator from Washington State, a Democrat, named Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson, as he was known. And he was the major figure in the Senate, and he had a staff under him of prominent figures. He himself was not an intellectual, but he had intellectuals under him, neoconservatives who gave the ideological basis for the political program that he pushed in the Senate with enormous effect. And this was heavily funded by the military-industrial complex and by major corporations as well, who saw the decline of U.S. power projection overseas as a major threat to their interests. And so this became an enormous influence campaign was launched by them through a series of lobby groups aimed at shifting not just policy in a more militarist direction, but the whole climate of opinion and discussion. It's what I call deep lobbying. We don't just lobby the government, you lobby everything, and you change the climate of opinion. And it was enormously successful. And by the end of the decade, under the Carter presidency, you got a fundamental shift away from things like détente. There was a policy of détente to have a cooperative relationship with the Soviet Union, to engage in economic exchange with them, to have nuclear weapons treaties, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and so on. All of this basically was ended by the end of the 1970s. And then neoconservatism became the dominant ideology and became the policy, first in the second half of the Carter presidency, and then during the Reagan presidency and through the end of the Cold War. And again, it was predicated on the idea of no negotiations, generally speaking, and use of military force and military intimidation as much as possible. Senator Jackson himself died of a heart attack in 1983, but his top aides, people like Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz, achieved top positions in the Pentagon during the Reagan presidency. They called themselves Scoop Jackson Democrats, who became Scoop Jackson Republicans. The neocons moved between the two political parties in and out, depending upon which one is more advantageous from their standpoint. And so this became the dominant ideology in both parties to a large degree. And it reversed the Vietnam syndrome. It reversed the policies associated with the Vietnam syndrome of what they called weakness. It largely, I think, through scare tactics, convinced the public. I mean, a key element here, there were a number of events that were cited. One was the Iranian Revolution, which was attributed to the Soviet Union by many people, although it didn't make any sense, because if you actually looked at what happened in the Iranian Revolution, the new Islamic Republic was bitterly anti-communist and anti-Soviet. They repressed the Communist Party, the Tudeh Party in Iran. But nevertheless, in the sort of hysteria associated with the Iranian Revolution, there was much hysteria in the United States. These nuances were lost. And an even more important event was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which I think really turned things around completely. And that occurred at the very end of 1979. Should I go in more detail into Afghanistan, or again, do you want to ask me a question? Do you want to interject anything?
Yeah, I do have a question, which is like this element that you're mentioning, that the neocons, ever since the 70s, were then successful in switching between the Democrats and the Republicans. This is something that they keep up until today. And if you're from everything that you're telling me, this inability or this refusal to negotiate, if that's a core element of neoconservatism, then that sounds to me very, very close to Donald Trump's idea of peace through strength. Um, did we? Was there ever an administration after the 1970s that was not neocon dominated?
Not really. I think Trump himself is skeptical. I'm seeing a lot of evidence over the last 8 years of Trump's skepticism of neoconservatism. Originally, he ran for president in 2016. One of his positions was better relations with Russia, rejecting a key neocon position, which is confrontation and possibly war with Russia, which is, of course, ultimately what happened. But he was very skeptical of that, and I think he remains skeptical. But he nevertheless hired a lot of neoconservatives in his first presidency. He hired a number of key figures very closely associated with neoconservatives for his new presidency he's about to enter, Marco Rubio in particular, the Secretary of State. And so he does, I think one of the problems you have is that the foreign policy establishment is so influenced by neoconservatism that there really aren't that many alternatives to it. I mean, there are a few. No doubt ones I think you probably had on your show, people like Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer, but these are rare exceptions. And so if you want people who are considered foreign policy experts with experience, generally speaking, they've mostly accepted the neoconservative ideology. It's remarkable how they really have had, we hear the phrase sometimes, the long march through the institutions. The neocons have done this with great success, and they fundamentally have changed the whole way of talking about foreign policy in a much more hardline direction. One more point about it in general before I go. Afghanistan's an important point because this is what really cemented neocon ideology. It's also set a precedent for Ukraine. But one point I want to note first is what I would call the Israelization of neoconservatism, in that this was a period when Israel was becoming respected as a military force. In particular, what they looked to is the 1967 war, in which Israel went to war with 3 Arab neighbors and defeated all 3 in 6 days. And there's no doubt, I mean, there's an Arab as well as an Israeli side to this war. So I'm not going to go into that aspect. What I do want to note is Israel's military performance was very impressive in that war. There's no doubt about it. And I think many people in the United States, beginning with Jackson himself, Senator Jackson himself, looked to Israel as a model of what the United States should be doing. This was a period when the US was losing a war in Vietnam. Israel seemed to show the United States how to really handle combative third world countries. They were very efficient in dealing with it. That's how it seemed at the time, at least. And so I think there was a certain idea that Israel would show us the way as to how to get beyond the Vietnam syndrome. And also another point is the Israelis, generally speaking, isn't 100% true, but generally speaking, they tend to disdain negotiations with the Arab neighbors. Again, military force solves problems. Netanyahu is the high point of that whole idea. But I think generally speaking, that has been an Israeli position for the most part. There are exceptions. We now know, of course, Israel negotiated with Egypt an end to Israel's occupation of Sinai. For the most part, though, they have a very strong preference for war, and particularly for offensive war. I mean, the Israeli military, one thing they did, if you're a military person and you've gone to one of the service academies, West Point or Annapolis or Sandhurst in Britain or Saint-Cyr in France, you're trained in what is called the cult of the offensive, that real military officers, competent ones, attack and defeat the enemy through offensive. A weak officer defends. And the Israelis were very offensively oriented, and that was very appealing to military personnel. And so I think that offered a model for what the United States could be, and that became the idea of the neoconservatives was, there's been a lot of debate in the United States about whether or not Israel controls American foreign policy or America controls Israel. And it's very hard to distinguish, really, because the whole Israeli idea is in the US government. The ideology is very much the same ideology, and it's based upon the experience of Israel.
I do want to go forward in the timeline, but I have one more point I want to ask or observation to add here, which is I had these discussions also with Artem Moini and Chris Mott here about the origins of US foreign policy, and they traced this foreign policy idea of the US back even to Washington and Jefferson, of the Washingtonians who thought that the United States, the young United States, does not proselytize, does not go abroad, and as John Quincy Adams said, we are not looking for monsters abroad, right? And then you had the Jeffersonians who were way more interventionist from the beginning, the Enlightenment. We need to carry it out. We are this first nation experiment that needs to change the world in its image. And is it, in your view, fair to say that the neocons inherited that strain of the way the United States looks at itself as a model and how it re-implements itself abroad? Or am I taking it too far?
They certainly presented themselves in ideological terms along the lines you're describing, that they're heirs to Jefferson and even more heirs to Woodrow Wilson. They emphasized idealism, the need to export American democracy. Democracy is good. The U.S. will, through military force, establish democracy in the world. It'll protect people from dictators. Later on, they developed human rights, as I'll discuss. That became, it was used cynically. I'll say that. I think what they were interested in was power and institutional advancement, in particular the military-industrial complex and the foreign policy establishment. I think that the emphasis on ideology in terms of altruism, that was for public relations for the most part, at least at first. And we know this because, in the first place, originally the neoconservatives emphasized power and America's need to use power to defend us against, communist aggression, but also we're a great power, and great powers project. All right. So that they mostly took a kind of ultra-realist standpoint, you might say. Although people like John Mearsheimer would note that they tended to throw caution to the wind. A serious realist, in his view, is cautious, or neoconservatives are anything but cautious. But power was really what they emphasized, at least in private and to some extent publicly. However, they came to realize privately that there's a very strong public desire for a human rights foreign policy. And they realized that they could use that effectively as a justification for American projection of power overseas. And in private, one of the key neoconservatives, his name was Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He was a Harvard professor, later on a senator from New York State. And he said in private, I've got a hunch that this human rights idea is our secret weapon. That's what he said, our secret weapon. And indeed, I think it succeeded beyond his original intent. He was speaking in the 70s when he wrote that. And again, this is something said privately. And so I think they saw that as their secret weapon. And they can, and since the end of the Cold War, of course, actually beginning in the late 70s, the neoconservatives began to use moral rhetoric, that America has a moral purpose to use power overseas. But I think that was more of clever propaganda excuse rather than an authentic motivation. At least it started out that way. Generally speaking, when people start using propaganda over periods of time, they start to believe it themselves. That may well have happened. But I don't think there's any question at first it was just a strategic maneuver on their part and a clever form of public relations.
Um, it all goes together because at the end of the day, an ideology needs to make sense at some levels. Usually they break apart at others, but at least superficially they need to make sense. And now when we go forward, um, I mean, Afghanistan and then the 1980s, and Reagan famously, said, yeah, well, we are going to outspend the Soviet Union. And this narrative stuck, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed. Although Jack Matlock, last ambassador to US ambassador to the Soviet Union, keeps emphasizing even today that they negotiated the Cold War to an end, which actually, in a sense, is very anti-neocon, isn't it? And then the collapse happened 2 years later for related but different reasons. What?
Well, do you want me to go into the transition out of the Cold War?
Please, yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, we do know that the Soviet Union was having serious problems internally, and that beginning in the early 70s, their productivity rates economically went down. Actually, they had some economic success up until 1970. But after 1970, the communist world mostly went into retrogression, including in Eastern Europe. North Korea also, curiously, also went into a certain retrogression. And the economic system performed much less dynamically and less effectively than it had in the past. And I think that was, more than anything, what brought down the Soviet Union. Another factor, fortuitously, is that energy prices declined in the mid-1980s in worldwide, owing to conservation. And the major export of the Soviet Union and today of Russia was oil and gas. And so that didn't help either. And so I think economic factors, more than anything else, brought about the end of the Soviet Union and made it essentially non-viable as a system. And when Reagan was brought around to the idea that Gorbachev was somebody he could deal with. There's no doubt Gorbachev very much wanted to end the Cold War. I think possibly he did because he was genuinely frightened by nuclear war. But more importantly, I think he was well aware of the fact that the Soviet Union simply could not afford these very high levels of military expenditure, given its economic problems. And so he wanted to end the Cold War to enable him to divert resources into the domestic economy. You might say he wanted to follow a policy of butter over guns. And he wanted to end the Cold War to enable that to happen. And it's remarkable how conciliatory he was. In 1986, at the Reykjavik conference, he proposed bilateral nuclear disarmament with the United States. And we could have had probably a denuclearized world, but Reagan initially, as I understand it, agreed to this. He may very well have done this partly because he was suffering from cognitive decline during this period, but his aides took him aside and told him that it doesn't matter what the Soviet Union does. The Soviet Union could disarm, but the US could never give up nuclear weapons. And so that was blocked, the idea of denuclearization. But the Cold War did end, of course, and the Berlin Wall was effectively ended, but dismantled for all practical purposes in November 1989, and that's often seen, rightly, was seen at the time, as the effective ending of the Cold War. And the Soviet Union itself ended 2 years later. And you really had a dramatic shift here, which is that you had a situation in which the whole justification for American power had come to an end. And this is a real problem. And there was two results from this. In the United States, in the first place, there was a certain ebullience and a certain sense of hubris that we won. And the neoconservatives in particular insisted that this vindicated their whole worldview, that others had thought that the Carter-Reagan policy was too confrontational. I say Carter-Reagan because people always attribute all of these policies to Reagan. It's not true. They began with Carter. Almost everything we attribute to Reagan, well, it's overstating it. Most of the main policy shifts we attribute to Reagan on foreign policy began with Carter in his last 2 years, particularly his last year. But nevertheless, the neoconservatives insisted that the hardline shift towards confrontation and towards willingness to accept a certain risk of nuclear war had paid off. And the United States won asymmetrically without American personnel losses. Sure, we'd come very close to nuclear war a couple of times, especially in 1983, when the Able Archer exercise almost produced a nuclear war by accident. But nevertheless, we didn't have nuclear war, and the US simply won. And it shows that we were right all along. And it gave a tremendous boost to neoconservatism and to the whole idea that the United States now essentially was in a position to run the world, or so we thought, that the United States had no effective challenger after the Soviet Union dissolved. China was not yet anywhere near what it is today. Russia was on its knees economically. It still had nuclear weapons, but its military was barely functioning. Its economy was in a deep depression in the early 90s.
Yeah, and
The United States, yeah, go ahead.
but didn't that also cause like a new crisis for the neocons again, like because they need to re-justify that approach on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's then this other strain that kind of simultaneously in the 80s becomes very popular, first inside the US and then outside, which is neoliberalism and the whole idea of restructuring the economy around a very particular US model of free markets that then also into the 1990s then starts to wreak havoc in Russia and the former Soviet space again. Can you maybe talk to that a bit?
My book, Revolt of the Rich, notes that the same lobbies that lobbied for this shift in foreign policy were lobbying simultaneously for a radical shift in economics away from sort of the managed sort of Keynesian economics of an earlier period of the New Deal, of the extended New Deal in the United States, in favor of a kind of Milton Friedman, Friedrich von Hayek type of economics that was indeed imposed in the United States towards the end of the Carter presidency, along with a shift in foreign policy. And to some extent in Europe, especially in Britain, of course, under Thatcher. And then increasingly, it was imposed upon Russia. An American economic aid mission imposed shock therapy on Russia, radical transformation to capitalism, with no significant economic aid for the United States. It was a catastrophe. You had a spectacular decline in living standards and life expectancy. Probably hundreds of thousands of people died of stress-related illnesses due to the enormous economic stresses of this period resulting from this shock therapy. The Russians were very embittered because I think from their standpoint, they figured that if they give up communism and give up their status as a world power, they'll get prosperity instead. And so they did give up their status as a world power and communism, and they did not get prosperity. And I think the reaction among many Russians was to see this as an American conspiracy to weaken Russia. I don't think it was a conspiracy, but there's no doubt that US policies contributed to this. And that was the beginning of a very increasingly popular negative attitude towards the United States among the Russian people.
Jeffrey Sachs keeps emphasizing this anecdote in which he describes, because he was part of this the Chicago Boys, this part of this club of like neoliberalization abroad, but he keeps emphasizing that while he made clear recommendations on how to save the Polish economy and especially the Polish currency, and that was immediately implemented. When he did exactly the same for the Russian economy and the Russian ruble, he was immediately told, back off, we will never save the Russians. Their ruble will go to the trash bin. That's basically US policy without officially stating so. And he says, I was naive to believe that the US actually wanted to really help the former rival, when in fact there was some sort of understanding, if not a plan, to let Russia bleed. Can you speak to that?
In his written account, he said, he expanded on this and noted that he had a conversation with Lawrence Eagleburger, who was the Secretary of State, saying that for this policy to be effective, a privatization, we have to do what we did in Poland, which is get debt relief and economic aid from the United States. Basically, Eagleburger laughed in his face and said that the United States will always see Russia as an enemy, or as an adversary, no matter what they do. And that there's no way Congress would approve it, or that I would even recommend it. This is recalled from memory. I might have some of the details wrong, but effectively, that's how the conversation went as he recounted it. And so, yes, there was no There was no economic aid during this period. Jeffrey Sachs, as we know, has been one of the most eloquent and articulate critics of U.S. foreign policy of late. He knows a great deal about this, having been involved in all the major decisions on economics throughout this period. And yes, there's no doubt that was the beginning also of deep Russian suspicion and hostility towards the United States. One other thing, though, I suppose, is that I do want to emphasize is that in addition to the hubris that I've noted and sense of accomplishment, there was an anxiety at the foreign policy elite level that the whole justification for America's overseas presence, its hundreds of bases overseas, its fleets around the world, the whole justification for the CIA and for a sort of a secret state, which was new in American life, at least with the Cold War, it became new. The whole justification for high military expenditures, having a permanent military industrial complex, to use Eisenhower's phrase, all of this had been justified by the Soviet threat. There was this enormous threat from the Soviet Union. And there was always an implication that if you took the Soviet Union out, if somehow by some magical process, the Soviet Union were erased from the map and ceased to exist, we wouldn't need any of these things. All right. And so history actually did that, as we know. The unimaginable happened. The Soviet Union was erased from the map. And Russia became, at least temporarily, not only a friendly state, but briefly something pretty close to a vassal state of the United States. And, what's remarkable is there was no change in American foreign policy, or at least remarkably little change. And I think that was not by accident, but by design. The foreign policy establishment and the uniformed military, the intelligence services, the military industrial complex, they all were very worried for almost a decade, really. How do we justify all these things to the public? How do we justify NATO in particular? NATO was the jewel in the crown of America's overseas presence. And officially, the only justification was prevent a Soviet invasion of Europe. And there was no Soviet Union anymore. The Warsaw Pact had been dissolved. And so there was no purpose to NATO. And, this became a bit of a joke for a few years. I remember Jane's Defense Weekly talked about how they were trying to think of new justifications for NATO. And the idea was NATO maybe could intervene outside of Europe somewhere. And the term was out of area. And the phrase that was being used is it's either out of area or it's out of business. All right, out of area or out of business. Yep. And they can't go out of business because it's just
the show must go on.
The show must go on. There's obviously institutional inertia. The libertarians, I'm not a libertarian, but they are right that institutions don't like to go out of business. No. And the powerful vested interests behind them didn't want to go out of business either. And so they had to come up with a new justification. And so finding a new justification for American power, this became a bit of a joke, the need for a new enemy. We have to find a new enemy. And people repeatedly said, only half jokingly, they missed the Cold War. But it was only half joking because they did miss the Cold War and they wanted to recreate the Cold War. Obviously, if you look for an enemy, eventually you will find an enemy.
This is the core for me about neocon thinking, the dialectic or this need for the significant other and the good versus evil, because you always need to be good. And we will go now to the other one in a second, but just one last question about the neocons, which is the current itineration of them, because the 1990s is also a moment when then suddenly this Mr. Kagan and a couple of people around him start creating the Institute for the New American Century. Like when a new version of the neocons starts solving the very problem that used to be the end point of the old the end goal of the old version, and they started spinning a new version of this neocon ideology. Can you maybe speak about Kagan and his wife Nuland and a couple of others, their great mentor Wolfowitz, and where we are today?
Wolfowitz was probably the more important figure during the 90s, I would say. Wolfowitz, again, he was a key neocon figure, a former advisor to Senator Jackson. He was deputy to Richard Cheney in the Defense Department in the early 90s. And he came up with a new plan for the post-Cold War period in 1992 called the Defense Planning Guidance Document. It was leaked to the New York Times, which is how we know about it. It was a very aggressive document, which basically said the collapse of the Soviet Union gave the United States a circumstance almost unknown in history, unknown to no other empire, basically, which is that there's no real challenger to the United States. And the United States has the ability to establish global dominance. I'm paraphrasing here, of a sort never seen before. And the purpose of American policy after the Cold War should be to seize this moment, not to retrench, but to seize this moment and to establish this global dominance and project it as far into the future as possible, and to intimidate any future challenger, any potential challenger, and to start looking for enemies. Didn't say looking for enemies, but that was the tone, because they talked about China and Russia as potential enemies. They even talked about the need to disrupt European unity in the EU because they feared the European Union could be a challenger. This is very significant because briefly in the 90s, the Europeans were actually considering the need to challenge American hegemony because it was felt to be unhealthy to have like basically a global dictatorship emanating from Washington. And it was thought that no European state was big enough to challenge the United States individually, but collectively, they could at least challenge America in terms of economic and political dominance, if not military dominance. And that would be a better arrangement for Europe and for the world than unquestioned American supremacy. And so the answer to that was disrupt European unity by playing off countries against each other. That was what was talked about in the Defense Planning Guidance document. The vital importance of preventing Europe from adopting an independent foreign policy, which they were considering. Independent meaning independent of the United States, essentially doing for Europe what Charles de Gaulle did for France in an earlier era. And the need to not only maintain NATO and insist that NATO had a function, but to expand NATO into the former communist states of Eastern Europe. And this was first broached, to my knowledge at least first, in the Defense Planning Guidance document. And so this was a very aggressive, expansive document. It's remarkable how the condescending and sort of very adversarial tone it took, even towards countries like Germany and Japan, which is one of the reasons its leakage was very damaging, and why the Bush administration publicly tried to distance themselves from it. But in retrospect, I think this was really the guiding force of the post-Cold War era, the Defense Planning Guidance document. And it was a neocon blueprint, and it's very much still with us today. And one of the key factors here is the need for a new enemy. And again, you look for an enemy, you will find one.
Would you agree with me, very last point, that one of the core ideological elements of the neocon mindset is that there are no friends, there are only vassals and enemies?
Well, it's a basic realist principle that Charles de Gaulle said France has no permanent allies and she has no permanent principles. She has only permanent interests. So that didn't begin with the neocons per se. I think about the neocons, though, is an extraordinary emphasis upon military force and aggressive military force, and the need to use force over negotiation wherever possible, and to do it Israeli style, to do it aggressively and offensively.